What's the most entitled thing a family member has demanded from you? After 7 months of failed attempts, my husband Kyle and I announced that we were finally pregnant. Everyone erupted with cheers, except for my sister Jacqueline, who smashed her wine glass against the marble counter. "How dare you!" she shrieked. "You know how long I've been trying for a baby. I deserve to be the first." Mom tried to tell her 19-year-olds aren't ready for a baby, but Jacqueline refused to back down. She grabbed her purse, then dramatically stormed out yelling that I better abort my baby within 1 week, or else she's getting the police involved. The next morning, she showed up at our door with printed pages from abortion clinics, shoving them into Kyle's chest while he was still in his boxers. "I made appointments for her at 3 different places," she announced to our entire cul-de-sac. "She just needs to pick one." When Kyle tore up the papers, she called the whole family demanding an emergency intervention. That Sunday, 23 relatives crammed into Mom's living room, while Jacqueline stood at the fireplace like she was delivering a TED Talk on why I was destroying her life by having a baby first. She actually had a PowerPoint. Our Uncle Jeffrey, who's a lawyer, finally told her there's no legal precedent for forcing someone to abort because you want to be pregnant first. She pointed at me with tears streaming down her face and said if I didn't terminate by Monday, she'd never speak to any of us again. But we called her bluff, and all 23 of us told her, "See you, Felicia." She actually left sobbing, and we didn't hear from her for a long time. And then, 7 months into my pregnancy, we were having our baby shower when the door flew open. It was Jacqueline. She walked in with her hand on a massive belly, wearing a shirt that said, "First grandchild loading." Everyone went silent. Mom dropped her cake knife. "Surprise! I'm almost due," she announced, spinning around so everyone could see. "I got pregnant right after that horrible meeting where you all betrayed me. I'm 10 weeks away from giving birth." Nobody was impressed, and when I decided to screw with her and mentioned my due date that was 8 weeks away, her face turned deep red with anger. She grabbed my arm and whispered the dates didn't matter because she'd make sure hers came first, then left before anyone could respond. My mom called me that Tuesday bawling her eyes out. She'd found out from Jacqueline's roommate that Jacqueline had been taking black market labor induction substances she'd bought from some website in Romania, risking her baby's life to deliver before me. Now, Jacqueline was in the ICU, but not because of the substances. Turns out, Jacqueline had found some girl on Craigslist whose mother used to be a midwife in the Philippines, and paid this girl to perform a C-section in her living room. The girl kept refusing, saying Jacqueline was only 31 weeks. But my sister threatened to do it herself with kitchen knives if she didn't help. They used box cutters sterilized with vodka. Jacqueline lost so much blood that her neighbor saw it seeping under the apartment door. The baby somehow came out alive, but he was purple and barely breathing. They both nearly died in the ambulance. The baby went straight to the NICU on a ventilator, and Jacqueline needed a full hysterectomy. She'd never have another child. When she came to, the first thing she did was call me from her hospital bed. "You did this," she gasped through the oxygen mask. "My baby is dying because you couldn't wait until me to have a child." The craziest part about all this is now that she was fighting for life, suddenly the family was split down the middle. One half thought she'd lost her mind, but the other actually thought I should have delayed announcing my pregnancy to spare her feelings. One aunt even said I should have just aborted. But everyone agreed on one thing. We all needed to be there for the sick baby. My own pregnancy became pushed to the side. I didn't mind much, though. My baby was mine and my husband's, not my mom's. It just sucked how anytime I mentioned anything exciting, the conversation got redirected. 3 days before my due date, I was admitted for monitoring. Jacqueline's baby was still critical. The doctor said the next 48 hours would determine if he'd survive. The scariest part was that I could see her through my doorway, standing in the hall between the NICU and maternity ward. And she wasn't looking at the rooms or the nurses passing by. She was staring directly at my belly with an expression I'd never seen before. Tomorrow morning, they're inducing me. Jacqueline knows the exact time. She's been asking the nurses questions about the delivery room locations and whether they ever leave babies unattended. The NICU is 1 floor below maternity. If her baby doesn't make it through the night, I don't know what she'll do when mine is born healthy in the morning. The clock showed 3 a.m. when I woke up to Kyle's voice in the dark, already talking to someone on his phone about Jacqueline asking the nurses where babies get taken after delivery. He was pacing by the window, explaining how she'd been watching the hallways and timing how long nurses stayed in each room. The charge nurse on the other end promised to add a special security code to my chart right away and alert the whole night shift. Kyle wasn't satisfied, though, his voice getting louder as he demanded specific names of who would protect us and exactly what they'd do if Jacqueline tried to get near our baby. His hands were shaking as he wrote down names on the hospital notepad, asking about door locks and panic buttons, and whether security could physically stop someone from entering our room. The nurse kept trying to calm him down, but Kyle wanted a meeting with hospital security before my induction started at 8 a.m. Within an hour, Francis Bergman showed up at our door wearing a security supervisor badge and carrying a thick folder of protocols. He walked us through every single safety measure they had, showing us pictures of the electronic badges that tracked everyone's location, and explaining how the infant security tags would trigger an automatic lockdown if anyone tried to remove them or take a baby past certain doors. Francis took out his phone and had me send him the clearest photo I had of Jacqueline, so he could distribute it to every security guard on every shift with instructions to watch for her. He showed us the dedicated officer assigned to the maternity ward and gave us his direct number, promising someone would check on us every hour once labor started. At 5 a.m., someone knocked, and Olympia Hicks from Social Services came in with a clipboard full of forms, explaining she needed to document all the threats Jacqueline had made for potential CPS involvement. She sat in the uncomfortable visitor chair asking detailed questions about every interaction, every threat, every time Jacqueline had mentioned our baby, while I felt my face burning with embarrassment at having to tell a complete stranger about my family's mess. Olympia explained the process for getting an emergency restraining order and said she could start the paperwork right now if we wanted, that a judge could issue it before the baby was even born. My phone started buzzing nonstop as Mom apparently told everyone in the family group chat about the security measures we'd requested. Half my cousins thought I was being dramatic and overreacting to a new mother's stress, while the other half started sharing stories I'd never heard before about times Jacqueline had scared them or done something unstable when she didn't get her way. My aunt sent 3 paragraphs about how Jacqueline had keyed her car after not being invited to a party in high school, and my cousin mentioned finding Jacqueline going through her purse at Christmas looking for birth control pills to throw away. Uncle Jeffrey sent a private text saying he knew a detective named Cyrus Powell who specialized in these cases and could fast-track a police report if we needed one. I hesitated for a second, worried about making everything worse and turning this into an even bigger family war. But Kyle grabbed my phone out of my hand and typed back, YESPLEASE in all caps before I could stop him. A nurse rushed into our room looking worried and told us Jacqueline's baby had taken a bad turn overnight with his oxygen levels dropping so low they had to increase the ventilator support and add more medications. She said the NICU team was doing everything they could, but the next few hours were critical, and despite everything Jacqueline had done, I felt my chest tighten thinking about that tiny baby struggling to breathe because his mother couldn't wait 2 more months. The morning shift nurse came in at 7 a.m. and went over the whole delivery room setup with us, pointing out on a map where each nurse would be stationed and emphasizing that babies were never, ever left alone, even for a second. She showed us the matching ID bands we'd all wear with special numbers that had to match exactly, or alarms would go off. And she seemed genuinely concerned as she promised to personally stay in the room with us through the entire delivery, no matter how long it took. I grabbed a piece of paper and wrote down exactly 4 names of people allowed to visit us: Kyle, Mom, Uncle Jeffrey, and Kyle's mother, then handed it to Francis along with very specific instructions that nobody else should even be told what room we were in or whether the baby had been born yet. Francis took the list seriously, making me initial next to each name and asking for physical descriptions of each person so his team could verify identities before letting anyone through. Kyle pulled me into the bathroom and closed the door, his whole body shaking as he admitted he was terrified he'd freeze up if Jacqueline actually showed up during delivery, that he wouldn't be able to protect us when it really mattered. He kept saying he should be stronger, should be ready to fight, but all he could think about was how he'd failed to see this coming and stop it before it got this bad. We held each other in that tiny hospital bathroom, promising we'd protect each other and our baby, no matter what happened, and I could feel his heart racing against my chest as we both tried not to cry. The bathroom door opened, and Francis was standing there with his clipboard, telling us that Jacqueline had just tried getting past the main security desk using a visitor pass from yesterday. She told the guards she needed to check on her baby, but they recognized her from the photo I'd given them earlier and walked her straight back to the NICU waiting area with a warning about restricted access. Francis said she kept arguing with them the whole way, insisting she had a right to see me since we were sisters, but they held firm and told her one more attempt would mean removal from the hospital completely. Kyle squeezed my hand harder as Francis explained they'd now stationed someone specifically to watch for her near all the maternity ward entrances. I could barely process what Francis was saying because Olympia knocked and came in right behind him with a stack of papers that looked official and scary. She sat on the edge of the hospital bed and started filling out forms for mandated reporting, explaining that every threat Jacqueline had made against my unborn child was going into an official record that would trigger automatic CPS review once the baby arrived. Her pen moved quickly across the pages as she asked me specific dates and times, and I watched her write down everything from the wine glass incident to the abortion clinic papers to yesterday's hallway staring. The paperwork felt both reassuring and deeply sad because this was really happening. My own sister was documented as a threat to my child. Olympia kept her voice calm and professional, but I saw her jaw tighten when I described how Jacqueline had grabbed my arm at the baby shower and whispered about making sure hers came first. She made copies of everything and handed me a case number, explaining that this would follow Jacqueline even after she left the hospital and create a paper trail if anything else happened. Mom showed up while Olympia was still there, looking like she hadn't slept in days, and she started crying the second she saw all the official paperwork spread across my bed. She kept saying she was sorry for all the family pressure and how some relatives were taking Jacqueline's side, but then in the same breath she said she couldn't choose between her daughters and hoped I understood. I told her she didn't have to choose. She just had to respect my boundaries and keep Jacqueline away from us. And she nodded, but I could see in her eyes that she didn't really get it. She kept looking at the CPS forms like they were weapons I was using against Jacqueline instead of protection for my baby. My phone rang, and it was Detective Cyrus Powell, Uncle Jeffrey's contact, calling to confirm he was opening an investigation into the illegal surgery and needed details about any threats Jacqueline made before or after the home C-section. I put him on speaker so Kyle could hear too, and started giving him dates and times while Kyle held my hand because the early contractions had just started, making my voice shake as I tried to remember everything. Cyrus asked really specific questions about who else heard the threats, whether I had any texts or voicemails saved, and if anyone had witnessed Jacqueline asking about delivery rooms and baby security. He said the illegal surgery case was solid since they had the confession from the woman who did it, but the threats against me would strengthen the overall case and might lead to additional charges. A knock interrupted our call, and a woman in a suit came in carrying more papers, introducing herself as the hospital's legal representative who needed me to sign forms creating an extra privacy lock on my medical chart. She explained that once I signed, nobody could even confirm I was a patient here unless they were on my approved list. Not even other hospital staff could share information about my room number or condition. It felt like such a small thing, but somehow it made me feel more in control, knowing Jacqueline couldn't sweet-talk some random nurse into giving her information. Kyle grabbed a yellow legal pad from his backpack and started writing down everything that had happened in the past week, saying he was sick of explaining the whole story to every new nurse or doctor who came in. He wrote dates and times and specific quotes, making a timeline that started with the pregnancy announcement and went all the way through to right now, with Francis standing guard and Olympia's paperwork spread everywhere. When he finished, he made 3 copies on the hospital's printer down the hall, taping one inside my chart folder, giving one to Francis and keeping one in his pocket. The contractions were getting stronger and more regular, and the nurse came in to check on me, immediately noticing the crowd in my room and suggesting we limit visitors to essential personnel only. Kyle stationed himself by the door like a bouncer, actually crossing his arms and standing with his feet apart, and every time we heard footsteps in the hallway, we both tensed up and looked toward the sound. Francis had to physically intercept Kyle's cousin Jefferson, who showed up with his phone out, trying to FaceTime the delivery to share the joy with the whole family, including poor Jacqueline, as he put it. Kyle's face turned red, and he told Jefferson to leave immediately, or security would remove him, and I felt so grateful I'd married someone who understood that our safety came before family politics. Jefferson tried arguing that everyone had a right to share in the moment, but Kyle just pointed down the hall and said one word, leave, and Francis escorted Jefferson to the elevator. Between contractions that were making me grab the bed rails, Olympia explained that we qualified for an emergency restraining order as soon as the baby was born, which would legally prevent Jacqueline from coming within 500 feet of us, or attempting any contact. Kyle immediately said yes without even looking at me, and Olympia started filling out more paperwork while I tried to breathe through the pain that was getting worse every few minutes. A different nurse accidentally entered our room instead of the one next door, and her mistake triggered the infant security alarm, this incredibly loud shrieking sound that made everyone freeze. The whole floor would go into lockdown within seconds if that alarm went off for real, she explained after apologizing, and showed us how the doors would automatically lock and security would flood the unit. After my initial panic at the sudden noise, I actually felt reassured knowing they took baby safety this seriously, and that even an accidental breach would cause such an immediate response. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom saying Jacqueline was down in the NICU asking nurses about their break schedules and when they switch shifts and whether babies are ever alone during those times. The next contraction hit so hard I couldn't even respond to the message, just gripped the bed rail while Kyle read it out loud and his face went white. He stepped into the hallway and I heard him talking to someone. Then Cyrus walked in carrying a small black notebook that he handed to Kyle. He told Kyle to write down everything with exact times and dates because we might need it as evidence later, and Kyle immediately started scribbling while I tried to breathe through another wave of pain. The contractions were coming faster now, and the nurse checked me and said it was time to move to the delivery room. They wheeled me down the hall with Kyle jogging alongside, still writing in that notebook, and Francis walking ahead of us, checking every doorway. The delivery room was bright and cold, and they started explaining all the security stuff again, showing us the matching wristbands we'd all wear, and the special tag that would go on the baby's ankle that would set off alarms if anyone tried to take her past certain doors. The anesthesiologist came in to check my epidural and adjust it while Kyle kept writing and I could see his hand shaking. The doctor arrived and checked me and said we were ready to start pushing, and suddenly there were more people in the room, nurses getting everything ready, and one of them stayed right next to me like she promised. I pushed and pushed while Kyle held my hand and stopped writing long enough to count with me and tell me I was doing great. Everything hurt, and I was scared but also determined to get my baby here safely, and I kept pushing even when I thought I couldn't anymore. At 7:23 a.m., she came out screaming, and they put her right on my chest, all wet and warm and perfect, while Kyle started crying, and the nurse immediately snapped those security bands on her tiny ankle and my wrist. For those few minutes, nothing else existed except her little face and Kyle's tears and the weight of her on my chest. They cleaned her up while she stayed on me and did all the checks they needed to do without taking her away, and Kyle took pictures with his phone while tears ran down his face. Within an hour, they moved us to a recovery room way down at the end of the hall, past all the other rooms and away from the elevators, and Francis came with us to make sure our names weren't posted anywhere. The room had no nameplate on the door, and Francis checked that the computer system showed us as private patients with restricted information. Kyle pulled the nurse aside and they worked out a code word system, where if we said pineapple, it meant to immediately take the baby to the locked nursery, no questions asked. The head nurse wrote pineapple in red marker on the shift report and showed it to every nurse coming on duty. My phone started blowing up with messages from family demanding pictures and asking why we hadn't announced anything yet. And Kyle grabbed it and typed one message to the group chat, saying we were taking private time to bond and wouldn't be sharing anything right now. The responses came flooding in with people calling us selfish and saying we were being dramatic, and one cousin said we were punishing the family for Jacqueline's mistakes. Kyle turned my phone off and put it in the drawer and said we didn't need to deal with any of that right now. Cyrus knocked and came in with his notebook and asked me to give an official statement about all the threats Jacqueline had made, but he kept it short since I was exhausted and still bleeding and trying to figure out breastfeeding. He mentioned the girl who did the surgery was questioned by police and would definitely face charges for practicing medicine without a license and endangering a child. He left after about 10 minutes, and then Dr. Sanford came by to give us an update on Jacqueline's baby. She said he was stable on the ventilator but still critical, and the next day would determine if there was brain damage from being born so early and losing oxygen during that horrible surgery. I held my healthy daughter closer and felt sick with relief that she was okay and guilty for feeling that way when my nephew was fighting for his life one floor below us. Dr. Sanford said Jacqueline was asking about us constantly, and the psychiatric team was concerned about her fixation, but she was too weak to leave her bed, so we were safe for now. Kyle's mom texted that she saw something on social media, and when Kyle checked his phone, there was a post from Jacqueline saying I stole her thunder and ruined her life by refusing to wait my turn, and she'd tagged every single family member she could think of. The post had pictures of her in the hospital bed looking pale and sick with captions about how I'd forced her to take desperate measures, and now her baby might die because of my selfishness. Kyle immediately took screenshots of everything before she could delete it, and added them to the folder he'd started with all our evidence. The comments were already piling up with some family members defending her and saying we should have been more considerate, and others telling her she needed serious help. Francis came back to tell us someone had been calling the nurses' station, pretending to be different family members, trying to get our room number, but they couldn't provide the security code, so no information was given out. 20 minutes later, a woman in a suit knocked and introduced herself as the hospital's PR person, and she was holding a folder with printouts from Facebook and local news sites. She sat down next to Kyle's mom and started explaining how someone had leaked details about the illegal surgery to Channel 7, and now reporters were calling the hospital asking for statements. She told us not to post anything online or talk to any reporters if they somehow got our phone numbers, and handed us a card with the hospital lawyer's number just in case. Kyle took photos of everything she showed us, including a Facebook post from someone claiming to be a nurse here, talking about the crazy sister who did her own C-section. The PR lady left after making us promise 3 times that we wouldn't engage with any posts or comments about the situation. Olympia knocked about an hour later carrying a thick folder and looking more serious than I'd seen her before. She pulled a chair close to my bed and explained that CPS had to open an investigation because of how Jacqueline's baby was born, and they needed statements from everyone who knew about her threats. She kept saying we weren't being investigated and we were just witnesses, but she needed to know every single thing Jacqueline had said about taking my baby or hurting herself. I told her about the intervention and the PowerPoint, and how she'd grabbed my arm at the baby shower while Kyle added details I'd forgotten, like the exact words she used. Olympia wrote everything down in her notebook and asked if we had any texts or voicemails from Jacqueline, which Kyle immediately pulled up on his phone. She took pictures of everything, including the screenshots from social media, and said this would help protect both babies from any future incidents. After she left, Kyle went to talk to the nurses about visitor protocols and came back looking upset. He'd found out someone had called 7 times in the past 2 hours, claiming to be his mother trying to get our room number, but they kept failing the security question we'd set up. His actual mother was sitting right there next to me the whole time holding our daughter, and she looked just as worried as we were. The charge nurse came in right behind him and said they were changing everything immediately, and Francis would handle it personally. Within an hour, Francis was back with a whole new system, including visitor badges that needed photo ID and matching wristbands that changed color every day. He showed us the new list where he'd personally verify every single visitor and assign someone to walk them to our room instead of letting them wander the halls. He also moved us to a different room at the very end of the hallway with only one way in and cameras covering the whole corridor. Kyle's mom helped us pack everything while the baby slept in her bassinet, and we settled into the new space that felt more like a bunker than a hospital room. Mom showed up the next morning with red eyes and shaking hands. She sat on the edge of my bed and asked if she could bring Jacqueline for just 5 minutes to meet the baby, because maybe seeing her would snap Jacqueline back to reality. She kept saying it might help heal the family and make Jacqueline realize what she'd done wrong. I looked at Kyle and then back at Mom and told her absolutely not, and there was no way Jacqueline was coming near my daughter after everything she'd threatened. Mom started crying harder and said I was being cruel and tearing the family apart, but I didn't chase after her when she left. I just held my baby closer and tried to focus on feeding her while Kyle rubbed my back. My phone rang and it was Cyrus calling with an update. He said Sterling Waite had given a full statement about finding Jacqueline bleeding on the bathroom floor and calling 911, and the woman who did the surgery had confessed everything. She told police that Jacqueline had threatened to hurt herself if she didn't help, and showed them the texts where Jacqueline said she'd use kitchen knives if necessary. Cyrus said the evidence was overwhelming, and charges would definitely be filed once the prosecutor reviewed everything, which would probably happen within the week. He also mentioned that Jacqueline might face charges too, once she was mentally stable enough to stand trial, but that could be months away. Olympia came back that afternoon with a different folder and a gentle smile. She said she needed to do a postpartum mental health screening with me, which felt weird since we both knew my stress wasn't normal new mom stuff. She asked me questions about sleeping and eating and crying, and then acknowledged that what I was going through was way beyond typical, and she wanted to connect me with someone who could help. She'd already arranged for a trauma therapist to come see me tomorrow right here in the hospital room so I wouldn't have to leave the baby. While she was finishing her notes, my phone buzzed with a text from my aunt saying I should publicly apologize to keep the peace and think about family unity. I didn't even respond, but just showed Kyle, who grabbed my phone and blocked her number while muttering something about people being insane. Francis burst through the door looking angry and out of breath. Someone had tried to get onto our floor using a visitor sticker they'd stolen from the cardiac unit, but security caught them at the elevator when they couldn't answer basic questions about who they were visiting. The person ran before anyone could grab them, but we all knew exactly who it probably was, even though Francis couldn't say for legal reasons. Kyle stood up and said enough was enough and asked Cyrus to come back immediately. When Cyrus arrived, Kyle had already printed out everything, including the security footage Francis had shared, and all the screenshots and texts and threats. They sat at the little table in my room, filling out paperwork for an emergency restraining order, while I nursed the baby and tried not to cry. Cyrus said the judge would hear our case tomorrow morning through video conference, so I wouldn't have to leave the hospital, and based on the evidence, we'd definitely get at least a temporary order. Kyle held my hand, while Cyrus explained that the order would prevent Jacqueline from coming within 500 feet of us, or trying to contact us in any way, including through other family members. The door opened, and Dr. Sanford walked in, carrying a clipboard, and looking less worried than before. She pulled up a chair next to my bed, and started explaining that Jacqueline's baby was doing better than yesterday, actually breathing over the ventilator for a few minutes at a time now. The numbers on his charts were going up slowly, and while it wasn't some miracle recovery, it was definitely progress. I held my daughter closer and felt this weird mix of relief and guilt, because I'd been praying for that baby, even though his mom wanted to hurt mine. Kyle squeezed my shoulder while Dr. Sanford showed us the charts and pointed to the improving oxygen levels. About an hour later, a different woman knocked and came in wearing a badge that said, Child Protective Services. She sat down with this thick folder and started asking if we'd thought about taking Jacqueline's baby if he survived, but couldn't go home with her because of the criminal investigation. My whole body went cold and I looked at Kyle, who was already shaking his head. The worker kept talking about kinship placement and family preservation while I felt like I couldn't breathe because I'd just given birth yesterday, and now they wanted me to take care of a sick premature baby whose mother was threatening us. Kyle stood up and told her firmly but politely that we needed to focus on our own newborn, and that taking on a medically fragile infant while dealing with ongoing threats would be dangerous for everyone involved. The worker wrote something down and said she understood but had to document that she'd asked. I started crying from relief that Kyle said what I couldn't get out of my mouth. My phone rang 20 minutes later, and it was Mom sobbing and begging us to reconsider the kinship placement. She kept saying it was the only way to keep Jacqueline's baby in the family, and maybe help Jacqueline not completely lose her mind. I told her there were other relatives who could help, that she had siblings and cousins who didn't just have a newborn and weren't being threatened. Mom said none of them would do it, and we were the baby's only chance, but I had to hang up because I couldn't handle the guilt trip on top of everything else. Francis burst through the door about an hour later with 2 other security guards behind him. They had Jacqueline between them, and she was screaming at the top of her lungs about us stealing her baby's only family and destroying her life on purpose. She'd somehow gotten past the desk and made it all the way to our room before they caught her. The other patients in nearby rooms were peeking out their doors looking terrified, while Jacqueline kept yelling that we were murderers and thieves. Francis and the guards dragged her toward the elevator while she kicked and screamed the whole way. I felt horrible that all these other new moms trying to recover had to deal with this chaos. A psychiatrist showed up within 30 minutes and asked us questions about what just happened before going to evaluate Jacqueline. He came back 2 hours later and told us she was showing signs of postpartum psychosis combined with trauma from her baby's condition and the consequences of her actions. He'd already started the paperwork for an involuntary psychiatric hold, which meant she'd be transferred to the psych ward and couldn't leave until doctors cleared her. The CPS worker came back that afternoon and clarified that they were looking at all options for the baby, including his father's family who lived in another state. She said we weren't actually the first choice, and she just needed to document that she'd explored every possibility. The relief hit me so hard I almost threw up, because I'd been imagining trying to care for 2 babies while looking over my shoulder for Jacqueline. The next morning was our restraining order hearing, and they wheeled in this whole video setup so I wouldn't have to leave the room. The judge appeared on the screen and reviewed all the evidence Cyrus had submitted, including the security footage and documented threats. He asked a few questions about specific incidents, and then granted a temporary restraining order that would keep Jacqueline at least 500 feet away from us, and ban any contact attempts for 30 days. He scheduled the full hearing for next month when we'd have to go to the actual courthouse. After the hearing, Kyle asked Francis to show him exactly what to do if the infant security alarm went off. They spent an hour going through the whole drill with Francis showing him the secure areas and emergency procedures. Kyle practiced over and over until he had it memorized and knew exactly where to go and what buttons to press. Watching him take it so seriously and work so hard to protect us made me love him even more than I already did. That afternoon, I sat with my phone and recorded everything that had happened from the very beginning. I talked for almost 2 hours going through every threat and incident with specific dates and times and details. I saved the recording in 3 different places, including sending it to Uncle Jeffrey and uploading it to a cloud account Kyle set up just for evidence. Having my own record of everything made me feel less helpless and more in control of what was happening to us. The discharge planner knocked on our door the next morning with a thick folder and a worried look on her face. She spread out maps on my bed showing different routes from the hospital to our house with certain streets highlighted in yellow. She explained the yellow ones were the most public and had the most cameras in case we needed proof of anything happening. Kyle took pictures of everything with his phone while she wrote down the direct number for police dispatch that would skip the regular 911 operators. She gave us cards to give our neighbors with a photo of Jacqueline and instructions to call police if they saw her near our property. The whole thing felt like we were going into witness protection instead of just taking our baby home from the hospital. Francis came by while she was still there and added his personal cell number to our emergency contact list. He said he'd already talked to the security company that monitors our neighborhood about adding extra patrols past our house. 3 days later, when they finally cleared us to go home, Kyle spotted his cousin Jefferson sitting in a car in the visitor parking lot with a big camera. Francis checked the security monitors and confirmed Jefferson had been there for 2 hours already waiting for us to come out. We packed everything into bags while Francis arranged for maintenance to bring a cart through the service hallways. The baby stayed wrapped against my chest under my jacket as we followed Francis down empty corridors I didn't even know existed. We went through the hospital kitchen where the staff barely looked up from their prep work. Kyle carried our bags behind us, checking over his shoulder every few steps. The loading dock smelled like old garbage and diesel fumes, but our car was already there with the engine running. Francis had moved it himself using Kyle's keys, so nobody would see us in the regular parking garage. We strapped the baby in while Francis stood guard, and then drove out the back exit that delivery trucks use. Kyle took 3 different turns checking the mirrors before finally heading toward our actual neighborhood. Jefferson never even knew we'd left and probably sat there for another hour waiting for nothing. At home, everything looked exactly the same, but felt completely different knowing what we were dealing with. I jumped when our neighbor's dog barked and kept checking the locks even though I'd just checked them 5 minutes before. The baby would cry, and I'd wonder if someone outside had made a noise that scared her. Kyle stayed up after I finally fell asleep, sitting by the window with his phone ready to call 911. We switched places at 3 in the morning when the baby needed feeding, and I took over the watch. Neither of us got more than 2 hours of sleep at a time those first few nights. Every car that drove past made us both freeze and listen until it passed. The doorbell rang on our 3rd day home, and we both panicked until we saw Cyrus through the peephole. He came in carrying a box with a security camera system that some victim fund had paid for. He spent 2 hours installing it on our porch and showing us how to check the feed from our phones. He positioned it to cover the entire front yard and sidewalk so we'd have video of anyone approaching. While he worked, he took more photos of the threatening messages on my phone for the criminal case file. He told us the prosecutor was taking this seriously and building a solid case for when Jacqueline was stable enough to face charges. The next morning, I found a cardboard box on our porch that hadn't been there the night before. The security camera showed Mom had left it at 5 in the morning when it was still dark. Inside were baby clothes from when Jacqueline and I were little, all washed and folded perfectly. Her note said she loved us, but needed time to figure out how to process everything that had happened. She promised to respect our boundaries, but hoped we knew she was thinking of us. I cried holding those tiny outfits, remembering when things were simple and Jacqueline was just my annoying little sister. That afternoon, my phone rang with the hospital number, and my stomach dropped thinking something happened with Jacqueline. But it was Dr. Sanford calling with an update on the baby's condition. She said he'd started breathing on his own for 15 minutes at a time without the ventilator. His brain scans looked better than expected, though they wouldn't know about delays until he was older. The prognosis had shifted from critical to serious, but stable, which should have made me happy. Instead, I felt guilty for wishing he would just stay sick enough that Jacqueline couldn't use him against us somehow. 4 days later, Kyle's phone rang at 2 in the morning with a number we didn't recognize. The voicemail was Jacqueline's voice, shaky and furious, saying we'd destroyed her life and stolen her baby's future. She rambled for 3 minutes about how we'd turned everyone against her and ruined her chance at motherhood. Kyle called Cyrus immediately, even though it was the middle of the night, to report the violation. Cyrus said she must have used another patient's phone at the psychiatric facility, which was a serious breach. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for that Friday, and the judge appeared on our laptop screen from his courtroom. He reviewed the stack of evidence Cyrus had submitted, including the security footage and voicemail from that week. He asked us a few questions about specific incidents and whether we felt our safety was at risk. After 20 minutes, he extended the temporary order to a full year with criminal penalties if violated. He made it clear that any contact attempt would result in immediate arrest once she was released from psychiatric hold. The relief hit me so hard I started shaking, and Kyle had to finish answering the judge's final questions. 2 weeks later, Olympia called to tell us they'd found placement for Jacqueline's baby with his father's parents in Oregon. The grandparents were stable, financially secure, and had no criminal history or concerning behaviors. They'd already started the interstate placement process and would take custody as soon as the baby was medically cleared. She confirmed we were officially removed from consideration as caregivers, which felt like a huge weight lifting off my shoulders. I felt guilty for being relieved, but also knew we couldn't handle that situation on top of everything else. Kyle scheduled a video call with the extended family for that Sunday to set clear boundaries going forward. 23 relatives joined the call, though half of them had their cameras off. Kyle did most of the talking, explaining we'd send one monthly update email but wouldn't respond to individual texts or calls. He said no surprise visits would be allowed, and anyone who shared information with Jacqueline would be cut off completely. Most of them agreed, though Aunt Chloe kept saying we were being too harsh on someone who was clearly sick. Uncle Jeffrey backed us up, reminding everyone that mental illness didn't excuse criminal behavior or threats. The call ended with uncomfortable silence, but at least everyone knew where we stood. Mom called 3 days later to tell me she'd signed up for therapy at the community mental health center and found a support group that meets every Tuesday for families dealing with relatives who have mental illness. She drove herself to the first meeting that same week and sat in a circle with 12 other people who understood what it felt like to love someone whose brain worked differently. The therapist gave her worksheets about setting boundaries and recognizing enabling behaviors, which she actually filled out instead of shoving them in a drawer. She started keeping a journal where she wrote down all the times she'd made excuses for Jacqueline's behavior over the years, pages and pages of incidents she'd brushed off as teenage drama or sibling rivalry. The support group leader explained how mental illness can escalate without treatment, and Mom finally stopped blaming herself for not being able to fix everything with enough love and patience. Cyrus called that Friday while I was trying to figure out the breast pump. His voice matter-of-fact as he explained the unlicensed surgeon had taken a plea deal for practicing medicine without a license and child endangerment. The woman got 5 years in state prison with possibility of parole in 3, though Cyrus said she'd probably serve the full term given the severity of what happened. He mentioned Jacqueline would face her own charges once the doctors cleared her as mentally competent to stand trial, which could take months or even a year depending on her treatment progress. The prosecutor was building a case for reckless endangerment of a child and possibly attempted murder if they could prove she knew the risks to her baby. I found a new parents group at the library that met Wednesday mornings. Just 8 moms with babies under 6 months old, sitting on yoga mats talking about normal stuff like diaper rash and whether organic formula was worth the extra money. Nobody knew about my sister or the restraining order or the baby fighting for life in the NICU. They just saw me as another tired mom trying to figure out this whole parenting thing. We compared notes on swaddle techniques and shared recommendations for pediatricians, and I felt like a regular person for the first time in months. The group leader brought coffee and homemade muffins, and we took turns holding each other's babies when someone needed a bathroom break, or just a minute to drink their coffee while it was still warm. The psychiatric facility called Kyle to inform us they were transferring Jacqueline to a specialized long-term treatment center 2 hours away that focused on postpartum psychosis and trauma-related disorders. The intake coordinator explained she'd be there for at least 6 months, possibly longer, with no set discharge date until the treatment team felt she was stable enough for outpatient care. They had strict visiting policies and all communication had to go through the clinical team first, which meant the restraining order would stay in full effect even while she was hospitalized. The facility specialized in cases like hers where criminal charges were pending alongside mental health treatment, with security protocols to prevent patients from leaving without authorization. Dr. Sanford caught us in the hospital parking lot during our 2-week checkup, having just come from checking on Jacqueline's baby in the step-down nursery. She explained his brain scans showed some areas of concern that would likely result in developmental delays, though they wouldn't know the full extent until he was older and hitting milestones. The grandparents from Oregon had arrived and were learning how to manage his feeding tube and monitor his oxygen levels for when they could finally take him home in another month or 2. She handed us a photo they'd asked her to share. Just a tiny baby in a onesie that said, "Little fighter" with tubes. And wires attached, but eyes wide open. And he looked exactly like Jacqueline did in her baby pictures Mom kept on the mantle. Kyle sat down that night with his laptop and created a family communication system, using a group email that would go out once a week with basic updates about the baby and nothing else. No individual texts or phone calls unless there was an actual emergency. No discussing Jacqueline's situation unless it directly affected our safety. No sharing photos on social media where she might see them someday. He set up an auto-response for any family members who tried to contact us outside the weekly email, politely directing them back to the boundaries we'd established. The system felt cold but necessary, giving us space to be new parents without constant family drama, while still maintaining some connection for the relatives who'd respected our boundaries. I pumped extra milk every morning and Kyle would drive it to the hospital in a cooler marked for the NICU donation program, along with the preemie clothes we'd bought just in case our daughter came early. The NICU coordinator never asked who it was for, but I think she knew, giving us a small nod of understanding when Kyle dropped off the supplies at the desk. We never visited Jacqueline's baby directly, but this felt like the right amount of help, supporting an innocent child without putting ourselves back in danger. During a 2 a.m. feeding when the house was completely quiet except for the white noise machine, I held my daughter against my chest and felt her tiny heartbeat while she drank. The family drama wasn't fixed, and probably never would be completely, but we'd built walls around our little family that felt strong enough to protect her from the chaos. My phone sat silent on the nightstand, No angry texts or guilt trip voicemails, just peaceful darkness and the soft sounds of my baby breathing. That's a wrap for now. Thanks for just hanging out and exploring all these little details with me. Until next time, subscribe for more content like this.